The following is an Eyewitness News special presentation.
And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
The 60s was an era that started off with great promise and hope.
I have a dream today.
But hope faded.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
America was shattered. Riots and protests had taken center stage, and by the mid-60s, a new generation of activists would define the decade.
We have not yet achieved freedom from our slave master.
The revolution could be felt politically, socially, and culturally. And America was bearing witness to a movement where the pacifist ways of leaders like Dr. King would no longer suffice. In 1966, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense comes to life in Oakland, California. Founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and comprised of mostly young black people, some in their early teens, they spread far, wide, and fast. It was the era of black power and black liberation, and the Panthers demanded decent housing, employment opportunities, an end to police brutality, and a power to determine the destiny of black people, and a right to defend themselves if necessary. Despite their militancy, the Panthers were well received in the black community, thanks in part to their free programs and education classes. One of those communities was here in Desire, one of America's largest and poorest housing projects. While the party's efforts to combat poverty and racial injustice made them heroes to some, they became a threat to others, especially the police force. And 50 years ago, that perceived threat would spread to the city of New Orleans, and eventually a long and violent standoff with police.
So what led those young men and women to the Desire projects, leading to the violent and tense standoff with New Orleans police that started right here on Piety Street? We asked some of the key players to share their recollection of what happened here 50 years ago and its implications on the city of New Orleans. This is the story behind the standoff.
Summer is finding Negro discontent expressing itself in a number of cities throughout the nation.
Ed Hoover has spoken out about the dangerous character of these extremist movements in this country.
A small group of self-styled revolutionaries who are not concerned about community improvement.
The very first place that the Catholic Church ought to try to do something on a community level was in the Desire area.
The Desire Project was 100% behind us. The people love us, and the people were out here.
Trial began this morning for 12 Black Panthers accused of the attempted murder of 5 New Orleans police officers.
The only thing that was challenging and that was being offered to young black men at that time was the military. It's a picture of me being arrested 50 years ago.
Before he was an activist, before he was a Black Panther, Donald Guyton, known today as Malik Rahim, was a soldier who served in the Vietnam War.
And I was in the Navy for doing the watch ride. I seen what was happening there. The dig I was doing that during the March on Selma.
It was during his tour in Vietnam that Rahim, like many other black GIs, became more politically conscious. He was fighting a war overseas in the midst of a racial revolution happening in America.
So with that, when I came out of the service.
When you came back and you became a welder?
No, I was fired.
You were fired?
Yeah, for asking how to become a welder.
Oh.
Yeah, I was told that they didn't hire as welders. and I was fired on the spot.
Just for asking?
Oh yes, oh yes. My wife and I, we was going through trouble because of the fact I was real angry, bitter, and I felt like I was used in Vietnam or even being in the service.
Like many black GIs during his time, Malik returned to the States after fighting for his country, only to be treated like a second-class citizen. By then, the civil rights movement had taken a turn from the pacifist ways of Dr. King to a more militant ideology.
The brother came off of that bridge bus, and he had a Panther paper. And I asked him, man, where you get this paper from? He said, man, there's some brothers right there on Canal Street selling these papers. I bought a paper from him, and I told him if he come over to the West Bank, get on the bus right here, come over, get off at the project. They ask for me, and I'll show him around. So with that, we started.
It was May of 1970.
The National Committee to Come Back Faster, that's what we started as a National Committee to Come Back Faster, with an umbrella organization under the Panthers.
Ronald Ellsworth says he co-founded the chapter here in New Orleans with Steve Green.
So Steve Green comes down from California.
Yeah.
And how did you meet? How did you guys meet?
Well, I tell you, the neighborhood Natchez, black Natchez in the neighborhood, older dudes, they told me, I'm looking for all the dudes who invited me to the militant dudes. I'm a young man, 20 years old, 21 years old, the rest of them are older dudes. All of them walk out the door. I said, wow. I raised my hands for I joined. So like I said, I was the first one to officially join. But the first office that was on St. Thomas Street.
When Ron first came out, I was in a senior dwelling.
Betty Ellsworth, known then as Betty Powell, was curious about the organization forming in New Orleans.
I just begun to come to the classes on St. Thomas Street, and they would they have what they call political education classes. I kept going to the classes. Eventually, I'd go around and do a little typing in the daytime, and one of the brothers, Chucky Charles Scott, suggested that I'd be good selling the papers.
NCCF members would sell the Panther papers on Canal Street. It talked about issues of police brutality, racial injustice, revolutionary ideals, and their community programs. The paper and the image of what a Panther was drew members from all over. But it also drew criticism from the federal government, who saw the Panthers and other black revolutionaries as a threat.
We don't care whether they're black Panthers or white Panthers. We just can't tolerate the disruptions of law and civil peace in this country.
In the 50s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover established the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. And now released FBI documents, COINTELPRO was meant to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalists, and the Black Panther Party were one of their main targets.
They had just had the shootout in L.A. They had just killed Fred Hampton. Panthers was being arrested everywhere around the country when we first came together.
Oh, that was a bad group. All they wanted to do was shoot white people, shoot police. We never talked about shooting white people. We only talked about self-defense. So we did have a lot of white people that did support us, but you wasn't hearing that.
And the intense rhetoric would prove to be challenging for the revolutionaries. Just 1 month in the Panther offices near the St. Thomas Housing Project, they were served eviction papers. One of the lawyers representing them at the time was Ernest Jones.
Told us that they were about to be evicted because the owner of the office was a local criminal court judge, Bernard Baggett, and he had objected to their political education activities in and around the St. Thomas Project. We fought the eviction on grounds that the judge shouldn't be evicting them because they were exercising their First Amendment right to organize. So we ultimately agreed that they would stay there for a little while, and then they would voluntarily vacate.
But where they would move to next set off a major alarm for the city administration and the police, who had already been alerted the Panthers had made it to New Orleans and believed with their arrival came trouble. Next in the story behind the standoff.
It's one of the most down and deprived areas where African Americans was at.
And I don't think people gave them the credit that they rightfully deserve for doing what they did at the time they did it.
When I asked the National Committee to Combat Fascism how they ended up here in the Desire Projects, I got a couple of different answers. And that was actually the case as I started to dig deeper into the story. You see, 50 years later, details can be very hazy. But what we do know is they ended up here on Piety Street in a building above the Sons of Desire Cultural Center. And while they were making inroads with the community that was once here, the city was already plotting their removal.
The 60s was a very bad period for the city of New Orleans and in many other states around.
While the Panthers were settling into the house on Piety Street, Moon Landrieu was settling into his new role as mayor of New Orleans. Landrieu, a former state rep and councilman at large, was a staunch advocate for integration. He gained a reputation and enemies in his fight to socially and politically usher New Orleans into a new era.
They were leaving New Orleans in the 60s because of the school integration crisis. It multiplied, so that many whites were leaving the city and going to the suburbs.
I believe that the good, well-thinking and sound-thinking Negro people of this state will reject this idea of mixing the races. I believe they will reject it because they realize it is better for their children to go to their own schools and to be taught by people of their own color.
Our racial attitudes were stagnant. There was a white dominance in the government, a white dominance in business, a white social dominance. And when I became a councilman, I was determined to try to change that world.
This is when I went to jail in the Civil Rights Movement.
Robert Tucker caught Landrieu's attention before his race for mayor. As Tucker recalls, his first encounter or non-encounter with Landrieu was during a march to City Hall in 1968 after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And as the march was leaving to proceed on back to the Urban League office, there was a fellow standing in the breezeway between City Hall and Civil District Court. And I later learned it was Moon Landrieu. He didn't speak, didn't say anything, he just watched.
And what he'd seen was enough to ask Tucker to help him run for mayor.
So there was a debate, a pivotal debate in the 1969-70 mayor's race. It was he and the former lieutenant governor. And the question was raised by the moderator, would you be willing to hire black people elected? His opponent said he would hire qualified people, and qualified was obviously a code word for whites. Moon didn't draw a breath and said yes. The black community at that point had begun to have some interest in the mayor's race because up until then, our political choices had always been relegated to the lesser of the two evils, whites.
Moon Landrieu not only won the race, but won with more than 90% of the black vote.
So I had no doubt that when I got elected mayor, if I got elected mayor, that I would appoint black department heads along with whites, and that I would do this in every area that I could.
Tucker was one of those appointments, brought on as one of Moon's 3 executive assistants, making him one of the first influential black men in city government. The political landscape was changing.
And at the same time, you had black militants. There were riots taking place all over the United States. We didn't have one here. But then the Panthers came here, and they were a very militant group.
What did you know about them at that time?
I just knew them to be a very militant, aggressive group of blacks who was seeking, I don't know what the ultimate goal was. Maybe it was separation, I don't know. But it certainly was against racial injustice.
It would be one of the first major challenges for the Landrieu administration. Black revolutionaries were under fire. By 1970, Black Panther chapters across America were in shootouts with police, were arrested and jailed on a number of charges, and had developed, at least among whites, a reputation for violence. With that in mind, city government and police officials were quickly on alert.
I could not accommodate what they were trying to do here.
But the New Orleans chapter hadn't threatened any violence up until that point. Instead, they did the opposite while in the Desire projects.
So the first thing is how to restore hope. How to make people believe that, hey, you ain't gonna just have to take the abuse and oppression of racism all your life and then die.
They worked out of the community center and closely with the center's director, Johnny Jackson, to operate the Panther feeding program.
Because a child cannot really go to school and learn anything if they're sitting in the classroom hungry.
Well, we didn't go around tearing big guns. No, we did party work, clinic work, sickle cell anemia. Yeah, we did. That's where they don't highlight that. They highlight just the confrontation, which was they did the confrontation, not us.
Right, we bus people to the prisons. Yeah. We bus them to the polls for election when Johnny was running.
Yeah, registered.
And you know, we went in the neighborhood. We went and made groceries on buses for people in the community that weren't able to go, like the seniors and stuff. We went clean their houses. We helped them out. But what we did was a sacrifice of love. We gave of ourselves. We didn't know what we were doing. We just saw a need and we jumped in.
Although they were painting us like a villain, internal threat, but we was the best thing the community ever had.
In 1970, the Panthers and the city government described Desire as undesirable.
It was one of the most down and deprived areas where African Americans was at. They really needed our assistance that we could give them. Deplorable. I mean, the murder rate, everything. But when we got back down there, we brought the crime rate, the murder rate down because we started running the big time though, to get us out of there.
We went through Desire, and anybody who lived through that period can attest to this. The safest time in their history of being in that project was when we was there.
Bob Tucker was also concerned with Desire's crime rate and conditions.
I've just been hearing a lot about it in the streets. High crime, crime-ridden. Nothing about the Panthers at that point, but just a poorly constructed housing development. And I got curious about it and embedded in Desire after I met a guy by the name of Henry Fagan, who's deceased, but God bless his soul, just was the mayor of Desire. And so he helped me to understand what and how bad it was in that project.
Tucker did a study on the large community and reported back to the mayor. Desire housing projects were built in 1956 to house large black families. That same year, a tenants association told the Associated Press the Desire was unsafe for human habitation, calling the project a real scandal and a blight on public housing in New Orleans. Even before Desire opened itself to tenants, the infrastructure was crumbling.
Now, the Desire project was a mistake from the start. It was built on a dump. It was poorly constructed. The place constantly flooded, and it was just too large.
There was no cement under the floors of the structures, so that you were literally walking on soil.
Were there any answers as to why it was built that way?
Well, it was built that way because that was the intent. It was a black development, and so Desire was built in a swamp, and on a dump. So it was destined for failure, but because there was no other housing at that point in that area for blacks, it became occupied.
In 1971, the late Johnny Jackson told the Times-Picayune 12,000 people lived in Desire, and about 8,000 of them were under the age of 18. Geographically cut off from the rest of the city, Desire residents sat isolated in the Ninth Ward. So you would understand why the Panthers would be such a force in a community that was so overpopulated and underserved. It followed a common theme with the Panthers. Chapters across the country set up in neighborhoods just like Desire.
Yeah, it was, I think the Panthers, again, made a big difference in the community, and I don't think people gave them the credit that they rightfully deserve for doing what they did at the time they did it. These were all houses all the way down, all the way to the track.
Leonard Smith III, Pamela Devizan Everidge, and Larry Everidge Sr. all grew up in Desire, and they remember the Panthers very well.
And they implemented the breakfast program. I used to go over there and get books. They had really good books.
Well, we just set up like children that didn't get fed,
milk,
meals before they went to school, especially like kindergarten, from kindergarten to like third grade or whatever. They held the drugs down. They kept the drugs from like flowing back there.
They stopped it, actually,
Yeah,
at that time.
They put a stop to it.
They put a stop to it, and they actually used to patrol. They used to do morning patrol, evening patrol.
Well, you know, this was the era of being black and proud. James
right.
Brown and all that had come out,
Yeah.
you know, and so it was actually kind of like almost an honor for them to be in our community. And I think that because of the influences from out, made it seem like they were doing such horrible things, but they really were a positive role model for the community.
While all three admit some of the stories about the living conditions of the Desire are very true, their memories growing up in the community are vastly different than the conditions described by the city and the Panthers.
Growing up, it was actually really nice growing up. We had, it was like Desire was like a city within a city. We had our own show. We had a bowling alley. We had neighborhood stores inside the community.
Yeah, and well, you know, when you're looking from the outside, you say, and everybody may have said that, you know, every night they were shooting up the place. Well, that wasn't the case.
Stories of violence and drugs would paint a different picture of Desire that forced outsiders to fear the community. But if you spoke to those living within the confines of Desire, they'd share their stories of thousands of children skating on Christmas Day, Turkey Bowl football games, and sewing at the neighborhood community center. Desire residents were playing the best game they could with the cards they were dealt. Leonard talks about this in his award-winning documentary, A Place Called Desire.
They had about 5 or 6 stores.
It was black-owned stores.
Black-owned stores. Yeah, they had entrepreneurs in the community.
When my parents came in, it was a lot of parents, like husband and wives.
So we had like a lot of things that kept like young people like active in their mind, you know, like keep occupied and stuff.
And we made our own activities, you know, because the city was kind of looked the other way when it came time the stuff that that community needed.
So when the city wasn't necessarily taking care of Desire, basically
Desire
the
was
residents.
taking care of Desire.
Desire, take care of Desire. Look out for yourself.
Still to come on the story behind the standoff.
Well, they wanted us out. They wanted us out.
When they cut the line, you hit a one big bang. Boom! Roll them up on them. And from there, 30 minutes later, it was us and them, a rat-a-tat-tat, shooting at us and shooting at them.
One day, we were told by our supervisor that the Black Panther Party now has a presence in the Desire Project. And that raised some eyebrows because we're thinking that that's a predominantly black housing development and they can recruit.
By 1968, the Black Panther Party had chapters across America, and their membership had grown to the thousands. But among the influx of members were infiltrators, placed by federal and local governments. Larry Preston Williams was an NOPD officer who worked to infiltrate radical groups as part of the department's intelligence division.
My job was to infiltrate radical organizations and do surveillances, because at that time, Panthers, in the Panther operation was high priority to infiltrate and keep a watch on. And mainly because the Panther Party nationally had a reputation for confronting police officers.
So why was the Panther Party important or priority to infiltrate and not the Ku Klux Klan, who had been proven to do hate crimes?
Well, I'm working for a police department, And Ku Klux Klan don't attack policemen. The police department here was less concerned about the black community as a whole, more concerned about the police department. In other words, if there's a group that's likely to attack police officers, that got our undivided attention.
Williams was a police officer who had to face two fronts, being both black and blue, leaving him conflicted over the Panthers' arrival.
Did you at some point recognize or at least sympathize with the Panthers during that time?
I understood their program. Free breakfast in a poor neighborhood. They were concerned about health care. They had a program that consisted of probably, if I remember, 8 or 10 points. You could not argue with the 8 or 10 points. What I had to argue with was their tendency or their rhetoric about shooting police officers, that in order to protect the black community, that one time or at some time they would have to confront police officers on the streets.
And that confrontation, the first one at least, would come sooner rather than later. The Panthers had been infiltrated by two undercover officers, Melvin Howard and Israel Fields. But according to the Panthers, their infiltrators were outed long before the initial confrontation with police.
You were infiltrated by the NOPD with two officers. How did that happen, and did you have any suspicions about them when they joined you?
Well, most of us knew that they was police. If there wasn't police, we knew that they were snitches or rats. But we knew that this was the tactic that was being used around the country.
When did you confirm, or what incident happened that confirmed that those two were officers?
Who confirmed it to us was some kids. And the kids that seen them knew them from seeing them at Tulane and Broad.
Mm-hmm.
They did. And these kids came and told us that, hey man, you know those two guys police. Since we know that, let's just use them. Let's just keep them around.
But they wouldn't stay around for long.
Can you tell us in your own words what happened to you that night?
Well, we were beaten with guns and pushed around. We were also jammed in a corner by some 40 to 50 people jumping on us, kicking us, punching us, calling us names as pigs and so forth.
September 14th, 1970. The Panthers held what they called a people's trial, and the suspects being tried were the two NOPD officers who unsuccessfully went undercover.
The 14th of September.
14th of September.
What happened in that meeting?
And I made the mistake of telling them that Fields and Howard was police.
Well, we exposed them. We exposed them. We just say turn them over to the people. They let them out the door. And he went out the door. The people had him, you know. Melvin Howard jumped over the rail and got away. But Israel Field, the people caught him in the street and beat him.
Yeah.
And he ended up going running in the farmer's store, and they came and got him out of there.
Were you sure that you were going to be killed if you did not get away?
Well, I felt sure that I'd be killed if I laid there and played dead instead of trying to run.
Israel Fields has since passed away, and Melvin Howard, who is still in law enforcement, couldn't be reached for this report. This is Fields' account of what happened during the people's trial.
And the people were talking about dealing with some pigs. So they took us both and they stood us in the middle of the floor and began asking the people if they thought we were pigs. Well, they said no one would be recognized unless you raised your hand. But if we raised our hand and we said something, we were cut off. We weren't permitted to continue because we were hit upside the head with a pot. He was hit once and I was hit twice. The second time I was hit, I grabbed whoever it was that was swinging the pot. And that's what brought the crowd of people on top of us in the corner. They began kicking us and stomping us. Most of them were people in and off of the streets. And from that area and from other areas in the city.
Were they Black Panthers?
Some claim to be.
The party itself did not touch them. We gave them back to where they come from, the masses.
Just days before Fields and Howard were outed, the Landry administration met with the newly appointed police chief, Clarence Geruso, after Clarence Broussard, a neighborhood grocer and owner of the building the Panthers were currently occupying, moved to have them evicted.
And the black owner came to me and told me these people were occupying his house. So I told him to go get an eviction notice from the court, which he did.
This gave the city and Chief Geruso what they needed to move forward. Tension was mounting.
I got a call that night from a member of the party who said, we're going to be in some trouble. We found out about undercover agents, and the cops are going to vamp. That was the lingo of the time. And
What's that?
vamp?
Yeah.
Vamp meant a raid, an early morning raid in which people often got killed, but somebody always got arrested. The Black Panther Party was named the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And one of the party principles that we understood perfectly was that they would defend themselves if attacked. And so they were prepared to do that.
September 15th, 1970.
Well, we was out on the porch talking with Liz Hodges' mother. She was trying to get Liz out the house. And then all of a sudden, they said, come on inside. You know, we seen them there lining up, they're about ready to attack. We told the sisters to get this kid and get out. We got on the phone, we called David Hilliard, the chief of staff in California. And he told us, he said, look, don't y'all put up no resistance, you know, give up. But before the phone, they cut the line, and you just hit a one big bang. Boom! Roll them up on them. And from there, 30 minutes later, it was us and them, a rat-a-tat-tat, shooting at us, shooting at them.
I could see it coming out of the schoolyard. I mean, it was right there. And you hear all of this pop, 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 pop. It wasn't no plastic in it. Yeah, it was real ammunition.
When the shootout happened, we had our location by the window, and him and I was at the same window. So when it stopped, he asked me to crawl to the different rooms, find out how many was injured, how many was dead. And as I crawled through the rooms, you know, and I would ask the same question, how many injured, how many dead? Instead of getting the same response. Nobody injured, nobody was dead.
When he shot the tear gas in the house, we put out a white flag and we surrendered. It let us out. The people come in the community, come out the houses and told them to let us out. Don't shoot us when we come down. Come out.
So the Desire community came out and said not to shoot you guys.
Yeah.
Malik, Ronald, and 10 other NCCF members inside the house were taken out and arrested. They were brought to the Orleans Parish Prison.
We went from there to court and then to death row, all in one day.
What you've been hearing on the news have been a bunch of lies, false propaganda, totally unfounded and just not true.
The people just wouldn't buy some of the militancy that they were trying to sell.
The community deal with informers here, not us, and that the policemen, the pigs, fired upon our building. First, we only returned the fire to protect ourselves. The Desire Project was 100% behind us. The people love us, and the people were out here.
Well, there are no community causes for it, and I think this should be made quite clear. This isn't a local group of individuals who are simply disenchanted with the services. This is not a civil rights uprising. This is not a racial incident.
The shootout would be a wide awakening for the Landry administration, who, up until this point, had avoided violent civil unrest in the midst of the social justice uprising. But the confrontation was far from over. Next on the story behind the standoff.
They came and got us because they said that the Black Panthers was going to hold us hostage to use us against them.
I got shot with a 00 bucket, went through my breast and came out my arm.
The Desire Projects, once isolated and ignored, had suddenly found themselves in the national spotlight. More than a dozen members of the National Committee to Combat Fascism were now arrested and charged with 5 counts of attempted murder after the 30-minute shootout with police. While at Orleans Parish Prison, Ronald's fingerprints matched a bank robbery that happened on Jefferson Avenue. He would soon be sent to Angola State Penitentiary.
Now, why did you rob the bank?
Well, to get some money, just for our expenses that we need. Not everybody in the party was doing that, because their party was workers making money.
For the other Panthers, bail had been set at $100,000 each.
They quickly allotted the case, accepted the charges.
The case had been allotted to Judge Israel Augustine,
The only black judge at criminal court. How did that happen? Just by random accident? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that.
In the meantime, Desire leaders expressed their disapproval of how the city handled the confrontation and the reason behind it all. During a press conference a day after the shooting, they cited the violent outbreak as the result of the city turning its back on a community that desperately needed its attention.
I think it can occur any place where you have the conditions, and I think that the conditions there, as we said in our statement, cry out for remedial action.
We went right back in the next day and reopened the office and started again.
The remaining NCCF members who had left the Piety Street house before the shootout had taken up inside of an abandoned apartment on Desire Parkway, right next to the community center, continuing their free community programs. But the fact of the matter was they were still in Desire, and the city still wanted them out. 2 months after the first confrontation, the NOPD was prepared to make a move.
Then we have a staff meeting at 3 in the morning saying that the police were getting ready to go down to Desire, the Desire Housing Project, to evict the members of the Black Panther Party that were illegally occupying the Desire Housing Project. It was suggested that I go with the mayor to help logistically bring the kids, I call them kids, they were young folks out of the Panthers out of Desire. I told the man that was not going to work. You're asking me to go involve myself in possibly bringing death to those folks because it was understood that the cops were going to be coming down in large numbers.
Tucker went anyway in an attempt to avoid any bloodshed.
So I walked out of his office, headed down to Desire, picked up guys that had been working down there, Cecil Carter, Don Hubbard, Charlie Alwell. And our attempt was to begin to negotiate with the Panthers because we had the creds, and what they explained to us was that we got to do what we got to do.
November 19th, 1970, a second standoff was looming, and this time 250 police officers assembled and marched into the Desire Projects.
There was nothing about that confrontation that reeked of de-escalation. NOPD went bananas.
They came in there with blood in their eyes. They wanted to kill something.
They wanted us out. They wanted to evict us. And so they came down with a little army tank against a bunch of teenagers.
Although we are not nonviolent people, we will resist this by any attempt by the fascist power structure to pursue that murderous plan of genocide on the national community to combat fascism and the black people of this country by any means necessary, including revolutionary suicide.
But as the army of police officers, tank in tow, prepared for a second showdown with the Panthers, so did the Desire community.
The word got around, the police coming out with a little tank. So everybody was saying, with a tank, not here. So people just started coming out.
So people refused to leave because they said, if we leave, y'all gonna kill these boys.
You got like over 400 people, mostly like 400 like teenagers and stuff. The police saw that, they were shocked because of the crowd. We had the tank surrounded between the wedge between the Panthers and the police, and we encircled them. So the thing is, we had like a standoff.
What were some of the things you heard out there?
power to the people, get those pigs out of here. I don't think Clarence Russo, who was chief at the time, wanted a real confrontation, a real shootout.
You got the cops armed to the teeth. You got the people that are the citizens that live in the residence of Desire, and they're literally face to face, facing off. And of course, the Panthers in the building that they had taken up in Desire. And so it was a tense situation. All it took was just almost anything to set it off. It was suggested to the mayor that you got to pull the cops out.
Ultimately, Landrieu and Chief Giarrusso agreed. Desire residents had used themselves as a shield to protect the Panthers, just as the Panthers had protected them.
In the community interest, if the police hadn't left that place as a result of negotiations that had been made and pending court action, the people who would have lost would have been that community, and I think the total community.
I'd never seen anything like this before. When the Panthers came out, the residents literally carried those kids on their shoulders. It turned into a huge, almost like a street fest, because they were their protectors. Now all of the attention was focused on Desire.
The story behind the standoff continues after this. The attention was now focused on the plight of Desire.
How can we, smug white people, say what they should do? We have done nothing to stop the violence that is being perpetrated against these people.
The NOPD and city administration made national headlines after the violent shootout with the NCCF. It even brought actress and activist Jane Fonda to the Desire neighborhood.
We're having a demonstration in front of the Housing Authority office to demonstrate support for the NCCF and to demand that they allow the NCCF people to live in their community.
The NOPD would use her visit to make one more effort to remove the NCCF for good. November 25th, 1970, Jane Fonda rented 4 cars to transport some of the members of the NCCF and their supporters to the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in Washington, D.C., but they wouldn't make it past state lines.
Police just was caught them on the interstate and arrest them.
Betty was with the remaining members inside the apartment on Desire Parkway.
I happened to look out the window and I see this mail truck about 1 o'clock in the morning. There was a knock on the door and another sister opened it. It was a deceptive device that they used. I thought it was the priest, because the police came dressed as priests. You know, the police pulled her out and they came in shooting. That's how I got shot.
Where
and
did
we
you
were
get
arrested.
shot?
I got shot with .00 buck. It went through my breast and came out my arm. I still have 5 bullets in my body.
Still?
Pellets, yes. Because the doctor said at the rate of speed that they were traveling, it wouldn't be infectious.
The National Committee to Combat Fascism would spend the next 11 months behind bars awaiting trial.
Trial began this morning for 12 Black Panthers accused of the attempted murder of 5 New Orleans police officers.
Part of the Panther programs, part of the 10-point program was that black people should be tried by a jury of their peers. I contacted Charles Gary, who was Huey Newton's lawyer in Oakland, and asked for help. And Gary sent me a pamphlet done by a colleague of his called Minimizing Racism in Jury Trials. And that pamphlet became my Bible. The law of Louisiana at the time was that a criminal defendant had 12 peremptory challenges. That's a challenge where you can take somebody off the jury for no reason at all. Remember, we had 12 defendants. That gave us 144 peremptory challenges. The jury selection took over a month. The trial only took a week.
The NCCF members arrested for the September 15th shootout with police would be found not guilty on all charges. It was the first Black Panther trial in the country to be tried by a black judge and a majority black jury. In 1970, the city of New Orleans successfully stopped the Black Panther Party from maintaining a foothold in the Desire community. But some would say they failed to address why the Panthers were needed in the first place. What could have been an opportunity to change the outcome of those living in Desire was instead met with misunderstanding and fierce resistance of who the Panthers were and what they stood for.
Do you feel like there is a way that you could have done things differently, or if you could go back and change anything, would you do anything differently?
If I could think about it, I could probably come up with some individual errors that I would redo in a different way. I was determined to integrate the city in a business way, in a social way, in a political way, so that everybody had equal opportunities. While I may not have achieved that perfectly, I think we made great progress.
Desire was a page of the history of New Orleans that had been left out.
Once the Panthers, got the Panthers out the project, they held the drugs down. They kept the drugs from flowing back there. After they got them out, that's when everything just busted wide open.
The Hope 6 grant led to demolition of housing projects across the city. Today, there's nothing to remember what happened here on Piety Street. Instead, it's now a mixed-income community called the Estates.
All of the housing development throughout the city was able to have one building left to replicate what it was before, Katrina. Well, they didn't do that for Desire.
No justice, no peace. But what does remain is the ongoing battle against social injustice in America.
And it's ironic that it's happening again. They 50 years later. They had their feet on our neck then, and they have their feet on our neck right now.
50 years ago, a new wave of activists would define a decade in the war against systemic racism and segregationist policies. 50 years later, a shattered country began to piece itself together, and those who were left with no hope somehow found hope again. And that battle waged on.